Okay guys, welcome to my iPad. The first thing that I want to do before going into the actual code of this is I want to show you guys from a visual perspective how this works. How do we communicate between two components with a service and an observable inside of that service? So the first thing that we have here is the service. Okay, that is the central part of what we're doing here. Next, inside of that service, we have what's called a subject. A subject is basically what we are subscribing to, or what we're making into an observable kind of, that basically transmits the data from one place to another. At least that's how I've come to understand it. So we have, let's just say, for our example, we have a user subject. Okay? And you'll see how this all fits together, or how this is all kind of spelled out rather in the code itself when we get there. But then we have a user after that. We have the subject. That's the thing that we can kind of manipulate or use to pass data around. But now we actually have to make something that we can subscribe to, or that we can subscribe to actually get the data from within the component that will eventually receive the data. And that's where the observable comes in. So for that, inside of the service, we will have a user that is an observable. Observable. Okay, so we have that. Next, inside of that service as well, we need a way for the component that is pushing the data to be able to send the data to the subject, which will then push the data, or do whatever we want it to do really, to the observable, which then the other component can get. So we will have a method inside of that service, which we can basically say user subject, and we call this function called, or this method rather, called .next, and we pass in whatever we want to send to the observable. In this case, we're going to be sending a user, and you'll see this again when we actually start doing this. So that is the service part, okay? So we have this here, we have the service, and that works very nicely. Okay? Now, let's talk about component number one, or in our case, what's actually going to be what will probably hold the object or whatever we want to send, and then that's what will send it when we're ready to do so. So we will have component, did I spell that right? Yes, I did. Component 1, and inside this component, we will simply have a method. Let me redo that so that O looks a little bit nicer. We will have a method, kind of like we did in the service, but this method will be a little bit different because, as you know, methods in a service, or in a component rather, can call the method from the service. And so that's exactly what we're going to be doing here. So we will go to the service, which I need to spell correctly. And we will call our method, which let's say is called, for example, send user. I don't know if this is best practice to call it send whatever you're sending, but that's what I'm calling it. And I'm going to send in, or pass as an argument, the actual user, or whatever we actually want to send, because that, see this user right here? Whoops, sorry. This user right here and this user up here, those will match. Okay, now that we've done that, let's talk about component number 2. So we have component, my iPad doesn't seem to be picking up the pen sometimes, but we have the component number 2, and here we have the actual subscription. This is where we actually subscribe to this. Okay. So we will have the service, use a different color. We'll have the service like that, dot user, which is this user variable right here. And then we will call off of that subscribe like so. Now, keep in mind, this right here, this part in component number 2, where we're actually subscribing to the observable, this is the exact same thing that you would do if, let's say, you were subscribing to an HTTP request, right, using the HTTP client. So this is the same thing. So what we can do here, actually, is we can do this, and we can say response. That's a terrible I don't know, even though I can't think of what it's called. Oh, either way. We can do this here. And let's just say in here we want to console log this just like we console log everything else. Whoops, that's not. Right? So we have that, and then we have our closing parenthesis here, and that's not very good looking. Okay? So we have this. So now we have these 3 things. So let's now think about how they kind of fit together. Even though I just explained it, let's visually fit them together. So we have this here. We'll put this in the middle. And we'll zoom in maybe a tiny bit. That's fine. Right, we have that in the middle there. And then this component number 1 kind of sits off to the side here. And component number 2 sits off to the side there, maybe a little bit further. That's fine. Okay, cool. Now what happens is this, basically, if we zoom in here a little bit, because we're only going to be dealing with this part right now, to 100. The way the data goes is like this. So this sends data to the service, via the method in the service, so it calls the method in the service, this, right? And then over here, where you do the opposite, basically, we are subscribed to the observable, observable, that the other component is pushing to. That the other component is pushing to. Okay? So this right here, zoom in a little bit more. This right here is how communicating between components using a service and an observable would work. And FYI, really quick, before we go into the code right now, you don't have to only subscribe with one component, right? I just did 2 components trying to communicate with one another. But you could also say this component number 1 has some information that it needs to, send to a bunch of other components that are relying on it. Well, you can do that because subjects are multicast. That's the whole point. It's a way to allow multiple things to subscribe to the same observable, to the same set of data. And so that's what this is basically allowing us to do, is that I only have this one component here, but you could have as many components as you want. And you don't even have to have the data sent through that first component. You could also only have the service and the component, for example, if you wanted to do that, or service and component number 2, I mean. So this right here, this is how it works kind of from a visual perspective of like which way data is going. And this also, I will include this diagram on the GitHub page where I post this this project, this depository. All right, repository, not depository. All right, let's go take a look at the code here and really get an idea for how exactly this works in a practical sense. All right, guys, so now that we understand how exactly the idea works from a theoretical perspective, let's now go over the code and see exactly what we're going to have to do to get this component-to-component communication to work. So really quickly, I have a similar setup to what I did in the last Angular video with Quill.js, but this time around, I've got a couple things that are different. Number one, we have 3 components. The first one is the users component. This is a component that will sit inside of our main app component and will basically just hold the user component and the user form component, which is where the data will eventually end up. The next thing that I have, and those are right here, by the way, okay, user form, user, and users down here. The next thing I have is the user's service, which is going to be the main thing that kind of makes this all work. It's going to be the central part that allows us to do this. And then on the front end, what I'm doing is I'm just using some Bootstrap 4, and basically that's just there to make it a little bit easier to understand. So let's go ahead and open up the things that we're going to need. So we're going to need the user's service. We're going to need the user's component, but not for very long. After that, we will need the user component, and after that, we will need the user form component. So the first thing we're going to do is go into the user's component, and we are going to create a variable that will actually be an object. So we're going to create an object then, and this is going to be users. Actually, it's not going to be an object, it's going to be an array of objects, sorry. So inside here, we will have a user. We'll say name will equal Garrett. And then, and then we'll have another object, and we will have the name on this will equal, let's say, Tom. And we can only do this, we can do this with just 2 users. That's totally fine. So now in here, because in the users component, we have this user component sitting inside of there, right? This is what our user component looks like that allows us to get this. And then we have the form in the other half, that's right here. So what we're going to do is, in order to get these to be able to take in the name or the users, we're going to create an input, basically some property binding. So we will do this. We will set up user will be of type object, and this will be an input. Now, if you're using VS Code, you can just hit enter when it comes up with those recommendations that you can see on mine. Make sure that you come up here and get these imports here, because you do need to import input, okay? And there will be other things throughout this video that you are going to need to import. So make sure that you guys are getting those, because otherwise it won't work. Now that we've done that, we can come over here and say ng4 and let user of users, and now we've done that. This doesn't work because identifier users is not defined. That's why. I called it user by accident. Now this will work, and now we can also use property binding here to get our user in there. And if we come here, we will see that user and user works. And the reason we only see that as opposed to being able to see the actual name is because inside of here, all we have is user works. So it's printing for each user works. So let's do this. We didn't have to do that. Let's say user.name, because we know that that's there. And this will say Gary and Tom. Don't worry about that not working. It's fine. Okay, the next thing that we're going to want to do, we can actually get rid. Let's actually add a button real quick in here now that I'm thinking about it. Really quick. Let's just add a div here. And we'll add a class just to kind of give some padding so we can see kind of the difference where things are. And we can actually do a little bit more than that. We can say padding, we can say margin, bottom, is going to be 4, and then we can say make the background, let's say light. See how that looks here. Good. I don't know if you guys can see, but there is a small difference there, kind of. We'll actually change this background or this margin to be the Y, so it is on the vertical axis, top and bottom. Now, the other thing we want to do is we will add a button here, and we'll just say edit user. Now that'll be there for both people. And hold that thought, we're not going to make an on-click event just yet. What we're going to do now is go over to the service, and we are now going to set up our actual observable. So now here in the observable, there are 2 things we have to do. Actually, there's 3 things we have to do. Number 1 is we have to set up a subject. A subject is what allows us to kind of pass data around and allow other things. It's called multicasting. Allow multiple things throughout our app in other components to subscribe and be able to get the data that we're going to be pushing through it. So the way that we're going to do this is we're going to say user subject will equal new subject, and make sure that you import this. Make sure that this gets imported up here, okay? And then close that off like so. We are also going to make this an object. After that, we're going to come down and we will say user, and we will have a $sign. I'm not sure if you were in a different country if this would still be a $sign. Here in America, in the United States, that's a common symbol that we use, and it's actually considered best practice to use a $sign at the end of your observable name to actually show that it is indeed a observable. I'm not sure if that's still the case if you're not in the United States. I'm actually not even sure, now that I think about it, if the $sign is even on the keyboard in other countries. It could just be your local currency symbol. I'm not actually sure. That would be a really good question. If you're not from the United States, please post in the comments down below if that's a symbol that you guys have on your keyboard, or if what do you use instead, or do you use that symbol? I'm really curious, actually. But either way, we're going to set this to be this dot user subject, and then we're going to set this as observable, okay, like so. So now this is basically just this. So anything that goes into here, we will get by essentially subscribing to this. So now we're going to create a method, and I'm going to call it send user. You can call it yours whatever you want. This is going to take in a user, and this will be this dot user subject dot next. Basically just passes along what the subject is doing. So this basically passes along information through the subject. So now that we're in our user component, what we're going to do is we're going to create an onEdit user method, and this is going to be what we set the onClick listener to do for the button that we created in the template on this. Is we're going to basically have this onEdit. We're going to pass in the user. We're going to say admin. Oh, actually, first what we have to do, not admin, I don't know why I'm using that. Make sure that you do this. So I actually previously recorded this video, and then when I went to go save it and start editing it, I accidentally hit discard. And so that's why some things are still here from the last time that I recorded the video. Unfortunately, that happens sometimes, but either way, type in here into the constructor private users service, and it will be of type users service right there. And make sure that you import that. Again, VS Code just helps you out a little bit there. So we're going to do users service dot send user, and we will pass in the user that we are passing in right here, because over in our user service it takes in a user right there for the subject. So make sure that you have that. And once you have that, you can now go into the user form. We can get rid of these templates here for now. We can go into the user form. We're going to create a user object. Next, down here, we're going to create a method that will go and subscribe to our user observable, right? we also actually need to, again, users service, so import that service, right? This will be of type user service once again. And down here we can say this dot user service dot not send user, but the observable, the user observable, and we can subscribe to this, right? I'm actually going to put this subscribe thing on a different line, make it a little bit easier to read. We will get our response. Whoops, that's not what I wanted to do. Response, we can call it the full name. And we can set user equal to our response. Actually, let's not do that just yet because that won't work. I want to show you why that won't work. Because we're not just going to get the one property, we're going to get an entire object. So let's just console log that for now. And what we do need to do, however, is go into the user component, and for this button, we need to say on click, go and get this on edit thing. So do that basically, and we will pass in the user there. That now works. The other thing we're going to have to do is we have to make sure that this get user method is actually run, and so we're going to put that inside of the ng on init method or lifecycle hook. And here, let's also just really quick make this look a little bit nicer. We'll come back here. Great, we have this. Look over here in my console. Let's see what happens. Right, we get the name, Garrett, Tom. So we can see the data is indeed being sent. So now let's just get in here. It's actually already inside of our form component. We just have to now display it. So what we're going to do for that is we can actually get rid of these other things here. We don't actually need them right now. What we're going to do is its name. Okay, so it's going to be response.name. So we will say this.user here will equal response.name. Don't worry about that. This has to do with some TypeScript stuff. It's not going to affect anything for our Angular app. It is .name. It's not going to do anything for our Angular app, but you can use the bracket notation and it will work. And so now that we have that, we can go into here and we will say, not that, we will say user, basically. User, yeah. Right there. And we have Garrett. Right there. Actually, realistically, what you'd probably want to do, now that I'm thinking about it, is not quite what we just did. Instead of doing name like that, you probably would want to have the entire response be assigned to the user object. That way, it's not just one property off of the user, because what we're passing in, what is the response right there, is an entire user object. If we were to come over here and add an age property to this, I'm 23, Tom can be, I don't know, 24. So if we were to do this, it would be object. And the reason is because we're now passing in an entire object as opposed to just a name. So if you look here and we console log this again, you can see now it is an object. And realistically, within a real-world application, you're not just going to be passing in an object that has only one property on it. You'd be passing in an object that has many properties on it, which is why you wouldn't want to do what we just did, which was to say the here name. Instead, what you'd want to do is just pass in the entire response, and then in your template here, you can say dot name. I won't do another one. We'll say dot age. Don't worry about the red line. It apparently won't work. Okay, so we just got this error, and what we're going to do basically is, the reason the error is happening is because inside here, this form, well, you can't see it right now because we took away the writing. So if we were to come back here and say user edit form, you'd be able to see that it's still there. Even though the writing is too big, it's still there nevertheless. And the reason that we get this error here on the side is because we cannot get name undefined, which means that the form, the component, is actually being created, before or without this existing. And we're trying to use this right here. So it's being created and saying, oh, user, I don't know what user is. And thus I don't know what name is. So we cannot get the name of something that is undefined. So the way that we're going to fix this is by creating a div, not with a class. We're going to create a div, and we're going to have an ngIf. And we're going to say ngIf user, simple as that. And we're going to come down here. Whoops. We're going to move this stuff up. And if we refresh this page, we no longer have the error. And if we hit edit user, we now see that it works just like it did before, but that's a way that we can see how it's a full object that we're passing in, not just a property, and everything works. All right, guys, that's it for this one. Thank you so much for watching. If you did enjoy the video, please subscribe and drop me a like or a comment down below. And as always, I'll see you in the next one. Take care.